The Iraqi desert was a vast, tan-colored oven, and the soldiers of the Hawks Battalion were baking inside their armored vehicles. For 72 hours, they had been relegated to a flank security role, a glorified guard duty, while the main invasion force fought the real war miles away. The mood was one of stifled energy and grinding boredom, punctuated by the faint, thunderous rumble of distant airstrikes. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Riz stared at the live feed from the Pioneer drone, his knuckles white. The screen showed the Shat al-Hayam Bridge, a vital artery over the Euphrates. Command's intelligence insisted it was a fortress. The drone's eye told a different story. It showed a handful of aging technical trucks and a platoon of disorganized infantry. The back door to the Republican Guard's defense was not just unlocked. It was being held open by a child. Major David Corbett stood beside him, his face a mask of rigid discipline. He pointed to their official position on the map, a safe, irrelevant patch of desert. His voice was low, tense. To move without orders was career suicide. To fail would be a court-martial. To succeed would be an unforgivable sin of insubordination. They were a cog in a vast machine, and cogs did not decide to become the engine. Riz heard the words, but his mind was already across the river. He saw the entire Iraqi front line collapsing like a rotten wall if this bridge fell. He saw a swift end to a battle that was turning into a bloody slog. He saw a chance to save lives, thousands of them, by spilling a little blood now. It was a terrible, beautiful, and necessary calculus. He made the call. His voice was calm iron over the battalion net. The order was given. The Hawks were moving. Now. The battalion erupted into a controlled frenzy of purpose. Engines roared to life, and a massive column of armor and steel began to churn across the open desert. A predator unleashed. The assault on the bridge was a swift, violent surgery. Alpha Company, led by a young, charismatic sergeant named Evans, spearheaded the charge. Evans was the battalion's heart, a natural leader who could make hardened men feel invincible. They cleared the initial resistance with brutal efficiency, their training and momentum overwhelming the stunned defenders. As Evans stood, waving his men forward to secure the far side of the bridge, the crack of a single high-velocity sniper round cut through the fading echoes of the firefight. It was not loud, but it was final. Sergeant Evans dropped to the dust, a small dark hole in his forehead. The invincibility he inspired died with him. The triumphant shouts of the soldiers froze in their throats. The easy victory turned to ash. Riz, watching from his command vehicle, saw the scene unfold through his binoculars. He saw the life go out of his best sergeant. He saw the young faces of the soldiers around Evans contort from victory to horror. Major Corbett turned to Riz, his eyes not filled with anger, but with a cold, grim prophecy, fulfilled. "That's the first receipt, Michael," Corbett said, his voice barely a whisper. "How many more are you willing to pay?" Before Riz could answer, the Pioneer drone operator's voice, tight with alarm, came over the radio. The drone had been scanning the eastern approaches. It wasn't just enemy vehicles. It was a full mechanized brigade, and they were not milling about. They were advancing in a coordinated, tactical formation. The operator zoomed the camera. On the lead T-72 tank, a commander stood in the hatch. He was looking through his own binoculars, not at the sky, but directly at the bridge, as if he could see them, as if he had been waiting for them. The trap had not just been sprung, it had been set, and the first blood had already been paid to spring it. The Hawks had their bridge. Now they had to hold it against the storm they had willingly called down upon themselves. The bridge was theirs, but it felt less like a victory and more like a target. The euphoria of the capture had been extinguished by Sergeant Evans' blood, soaking into the ancient dust near the bridge's approach. A grim, silent efficiency fell over the Hawks. They were no longer invaders on the offensive. They were men digging in for their lives. Lieutenant Colonel Riz moved among them, his presence a quiet anchor in the growing storm. He saw the looks in their eyes, the shock, the fear, the unspoken question. He had asked for their trust, and the first payment had been a man they all loved. He gave no grand speeches. His orders were calm, precise, focusing on the work, positioning tanks for enfilading fire, setting up overlapping fields of fire for the Bradleys, having engineers place demolition charges on the bridge itself as a last resort. A failsafe he prayed he would not use. Major Corbett oversaw the logistics, his face a stony mask of duty. He worked tirelessly, but every interaction with Riz was cold, professional, a chasm of disagreement, widened by Evans's death. He was ensuring the battalion fought well, not because he believed in the decision, but because he refused to let the men pay for a mistake with their lives. The sun climbed, turning the metal of their vehicles into branding irons. The Pioneer drone was their only eye, circling high above. The operator's voice became the soundtrack to their anxiety, a calm, technical narration of impending doom. Enemy vanguard is a battalion-sized element, T-72s, BMPs, estimate contact in 20 minutes. The wait was a physical wait. Men checked and rechecked their weapons. The smell of diesel, oil, and nervous sweat mixed with the dry desert air. Then they came, not as a disorganized mob, but as a professional army. A line of T-72 tanks crested the low rise to the east, their long barrels looking like accusing fingers. They moved with a deliberate, menacing grace. The world erupted. The first Iraqi salvo screamed in, kicking up massive geysers of earth and rock around the American positions. The concussion waves hammered against armored hulls. Riz, in his command track, heard the shrapnel ping against the side like deadly hail. His response was disciplined, brutal. The Abrams tanks of the Hawks dug into hull-down positions, fired almost as one. The roar was deafening. Modern American sabot rounds tore through the distance. A lead T-72 exploded, its turret spinning into the air in a grotesque, silent ballet before crashing down. Then another. The Iraqis pushed forward, their BMPs disgorging infantry who scrambled for cover, adding a storm of small arms fire to the thunder of the tanks. A Bradley fighting vehicle to Riz's left took a direct hit from an RPG. The vehicle shuddered, smoke pouring from its hatches. The crew did not get out. For 2 hours, the battle was a deafening, violent stalemate. The Hawks' superior training and technology held the line, but the cost was mounting. Ammunition was being expended at an alarming rate. The medics had set up a makeshift aid station, and it was already filling up with bleeding, broken men. Through the smoke and chaos, Riz saw it. The Iraqi commander was not just throwing his forces into a meat grinder. He was probing, testing the edges of their perimeter. A company of Iraqi infantry attempted to flank them along a dry wadi to the south. It was only thanks to the watchful eye of the Pioneer drone that Riz saw the movement in time. He redirected a platoon of Bradleys, which met the flanking force with a devastating hail of 25mm chain gun fire, cutting them down before they could get close. The Iraqi attack faltered and then broke off. The remaining enemy vehicles withdrew behind the ridge, leaving behind the burning wrecks of their armor and the bodies of their men. A temporary, fragile silence fell, broken only by the crackle of flames and the desperate cries of the wounded. The Hawks had held. But as Riz surveyed his position, the smoke, the damaged vehicles, the exhausted, bloodied faces of his soldiers, he knew the truth. This was just the beginning. The enemy commander had taken their measure. He knew their strength, their position, their determination. And he would be back. The next attack would not be a test. It would be an execution. Riz looked at the demolition charges wired to the bridge. The symbol of their objective had become the symbol of their potential tomb. The silence after the battle was a liar. It promised respite, but delivered only dread. The Hawks licked their wounds under a scorching sun. The aid station was overflowing. The smell of burned metal, cordite, and blood was a permanent stain in the air. Ammunition was critically low. Water was being rationed. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety had become the battalion's new normal. Lieutenant Colonel Riz stood over a map laid out on the hood of his Humvee, the paper fluttering in the hot wind. Major Corbett stood opposite him, his arms crossed. The argument was over. The time for "I told you so" had passed, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. "We cannot withstand another direct assault," Corbett stated, his voice flat. "They know our positions. They know our strength. The next push will break us." Riz did not look up. His eyes were fixed on the map, but he wasn't seeing the lines and symbols. He was seeing the Pioneer drone feed from the night, the way the Iraqi forces had consolidated, their supply trucks arriving, their artillery being emplaced. They were preparing for a final, overwhelming hammer blow. "They expect a static defense," Riz said, his voice quiet but cutting through the wind. "They expect us to dig in deeper and wait to be crushed. So we won't give them a static defense." He outlined his plan. It was audacious, borderline insane. He called it the Ghost Battalion. They would abandon the concept of a fixed perimeter. Under the cover of darkness, the battalion would transform. It would splinter into a dozen highly mobile, independent teams. Tank hunters with javelins, sniper teams, mobile mortars mounted on fast vehicles. Their eyes and their brain would be the Pioneer drones. The operators, now the most critical soldiers in the battalion, would work in shifts, maintaining a constant, unblinking watch over the enemy. They would identify assembly areas, command posts, and supply depots. The ghost teams would not hold ground. They would strike from the darkness and then vanish. A javelin team would hit a tank column from one flank, then race through the desert to set up an ambush for the infantry reinforcements rushing to the scene. The mortars would fire a few devastating rounds and immediately displace before counter-battery radar could find them. They would create chaos. They would make the Iraqis believe they were surrounded by a force 3 times their size. They would attack not just men and machines, but the enemy's will to fight. Corbett listened, his skepticism slowly giving way to a reluctant, professional respect. It was a massive risk. It required perfect coordination, absolute discipline, and a radical trust in the drone operators. A single mistake, a team caught out in the open, would be annihilated. As darkness fell, the Hawks began their metamorphosis. The low grumble of engines starting up sounded like the stirring of a sleeping beast. Headlights remained off, soldiers using night vision goggles. The teams moved out, dissolving into the vast black emptiness of the desert. The night came alive with ghosts. The first Iraqi tank commander to die never saw his killer. A Javelin missile dropped from the sky, piercing the thin armor of his T-72's turret top. By the time his comrades reacted, the American team was already gone, their vehicle kicking up a plume of dust invisible in the moonless night. An Iraqi supply convoy, thinking it was safe, miles behind the front, was ravaged by precise mortar fire, its fuel and ammunition lighting up the sky. The shoot-and-scoot mortars were 5 miles away before the first Iraqi search party arrived. The Pioneer drones watched it all, their operators calmly directing the chaos. Ghost 1, enemy infantry dismounting at your 10 o'clock, 500 meters. Ghost 3, you have armor moving into your sector, advise displace north. The Iraqi advance stalled before it even began. Their formations broke down into confused, isolated units, each convinced it was the next target. Reports flooded the Iraqi command of attacks from all directions. The single trapped American battalion had, in the space of a few hours, become a phantom army. Back at the bridge, Riz monitored the flow of battle on his radio, the frantic, victorious reports from his ghost teams, a stark contrast to the tense silence of the morning. He had rolled the dice with the highest stakes imaginable. He looked at the weary but exhilarated face of his drone operator, then at Major Corbett, who gave a single, slow nod. The plan was working. They were no longer just holding on. They were taking the fight to the enemy. They were no longer the hawks, a bird of prey. They had become something far more terrifying, something that could not be seen, pinned down, or killed. They had become a nightmare. The night's success was a fragile shield against the coming dawn. The Ghost Battalion had sown chaos, but as the first hints of light bled into the eastern sky, the Iraqi commander adapted. The probing attacks ceased. The radio chatter, which the Hawks' signals intelligence had been monitoring, fell into an ominous, disciplined silence. The enemy was no longer reacting. He was preparing. Lieutenant Colonel Riz felt the shift in the atmosphere. The phantom strikes had bought them time, not victory. The Pioneer drone feed now showed a chilling new development. The Iraqis were no longer assembling in large, vulnerable formations. Instead, they were converging from multiple axes in smaller, coordinated battle groups, aiming to compress the Hawks' operational space and negate their mobility. It was a net, and it was closing fast. Major Corbett approached, his face grim. The initial reports were in. They were critically low on Javelin missiles. The mobile mortar teams were down to their last few rounds. The battalion was running on fumes and willpower. "The next assault will be the last, Michael," Corbett said, the formality gone, replaced by a raw, veteran's certainty. "They're going to hit us from the north, east, and south simultaneously. They've figured out we can't be strong everywhere at once." As if on cue, the world exploded. This was not like the first battle. This was a coordinated three-pronged hammer blow. Iraqi artillery, silent throughout the night, now walked a wall of fire and steel across the American positions. T-72s advanced behind the barrage, their machine guns hosing down suspected ghost team positions. BMPs disgorged infantry that moved forward with a grim determination that had been absent the day before. The Hawks fought back with the desperate fury of cornered animals. Javelin teams stood their ground, firing their last missiles at point-blank range before being overrun. A Bradley, its tracks blown off, continued to fire its 25mm cannon until a tank round turned it into a fireball. the southern flank, held by a platoon of young infantrymen, began to crumble under the weight of a full company of Republican Guard. A gap was opening. If it was exploited, the Iraqis would pour into the heart of the battalion's position and overrun the command post and the aid station. Riz, his command vehicle rocking from nearby impacts, saw the disaster unfolding on the drone feed. He grabbed the radio, his voice cracking with a urgency he could not conceal, ordering any available unit to plug the hole. But there were no units left. Every team, every vehicle, was locked in its own life-or-death struggle. It was then that Major Corbett made his choice. Without a word to Riz, he climbed into the cupola of his own M2 Bradley. He keyed his radio, his voice calm and clear, addressing the few men he could gather from the headquarters element: cooks, clerks, drivers. All remaining HQ elements, on me. We're counterattacking. Riz stared, horrified, as Corbett's small, ad hoc force of 3 Bradleys surged forward, not to reinforce, but to charge directly into the teeth of the Iraqi advance. It was a suicide mission. Its only purpose was to be a speed bump, to shock and disorient the enemy long enough for the southern flank to reorganize. Corbett's Bradley led the way, its chain gun roaring, cutting a bloody swath through the advancing Iraqi infantry. For a glorious, terrible minute, it worked. The Iraqi advance faltered, confused by the audacity of the counter-thrust. Then a flash, a direct hit from a T-72. Corbett's vehicle vanished in a ball of fire and black smoke. The charge had broken the enemy's momentum. The southern flank held. But on the main radio net, Major Corbett's channel was silent. The battle raged for another hour, a brutal close-quarters fight of smoke, fire, and bayonets. Just as the last of the Hawk's strength was about to give way, a new sound filled the air. A deep, thrumming roar from the west. Over the western horizon, a flight of Apache helicopters appeared like avenging angels. Behind them, the lead elements of the main American armored brigade finally, mercifully, crested the ridge, their tanks firing on the move, smashing into the exhausted Iraqi forces. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The Iraqi attack collapsed under the fresh onslaught, as the sounds of battle faded, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of dying fires. Riz stumbled from his vehicle. He made his way through the carnage to the still smoking wreck of Corbett's Bradley. There was nothing left to recover. Only scorched metal and the smell of burned diesel and flesh. He stood there, the victorious commander on a field of his own making. He had held the bridge. He had changed the course of the battle. He had saved the main offensive. And he had paid for it with the blood of his executive officer, the man who had warned him, the man who had followed him into hell anyway, and who had given his life to clean up the mess. The cost of the bridge was no longer an abstract concept. It had a name, a face, and a funeral pyre. The bridge stood, a stark, gray monument against the smoke-stained sky. The Euphrates flowed peacefully beneath it, a cruel contrast to the carnage littering its banks. The Hawks were no longer fighting. They were simply surviving, moving through the wreckage in a state of shock, tending to wounds, counting the dead. The arrival of the main force was not a celebration. It was a surreal intrusion of normalcy into their private hell. Lieutenant Colonel Riz moved among his men, his uniform stained with dust and sweat. He clasped shoulders, met the hollow eyes of his soldiers, and offered quiet words. They had done the impossible. They had held. But the victory felt like a phantom limb, an absence where triumph should have been. Everywhere he looked, he saw the cost, the bandaged wounds, the body bags being lined up, the vacant stare of a young private who had held a position alone for hours. And he saw the ghost of Major Corbett in the eyes of every surviving officer. The debriefing was held in a pristine command tent erected by the advancing brigade. The air was cool, filtered by generators. The officers from division were crisp, professional, and utterly detached. They presented the facts as they saw them. The seizure of the Shat al-Hayam Bridge had been the pivotal moment of the offensive. The Republican Guard front had collapsed. The road to Baghdad was open. The Hawks Battalion was, by any objective measure, the reason for a swift and decisive victory. Then came the but. The lead officer, a stern one-star general, leaned forward, his hands clasped. The precedent, Colonel Riz, is unacceptable. We cannot have battalion commanders acting as independent warlords, interpreting orders as they see fit. What you did was brilliant. It was also a court-martial offense. If we celebrate this, we encourage insubordination. We break the very chain of command that makes this army function. The offer was laid out with cold, bureaucratic precision. There would be no official recognition of the Hawks' actions. No unit citations. The story of the Ghost Battalion and its 24-hour stand would be classified, buried in a vault to be forgotten. The official record would state that the bridge was taken by the main offensive, according to plan. In return, the men would not be punished. Their careers would continue. Riz himself would be quietly promoted and given a choice posting, a reward for his silence, a bribe for his complicity. It was a deal, clean and simple. Their honor, in exchange for the Army's order. Riz walked out of the tent into the blinding sun. The weight of the decision was heavier than any enemy assault. He gathered his surviving platoon sergeants and company commanders on the bridge itself. They stood where Sergeant Evans had fallen, where Corbett had made his last stand. He did not lie to them. He told them the truth, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. He told them about the victory, and he told them about the price of that victory. Their legacy would be a secret, their heroism a classified file. He expected anger. He expected outrage. Instead, he saw a grim understanding settle over their weary faces. A young captain, his arm in a sling, simply nodded. "We know what we did, sir. They don't need to." Another sergeant, his face etched with soot and grief, spat into the river. "We didn't do it for them." The truth was in their eyes. They hadn't fought for glory or for medals. They had fought for the man next to them. They had fought for Evans. They had fought for Corbett. They had fought for Riz, even when they doubted him. The bond forged in the desert, in the darkness, and in the fire was theirs alone. No general in a clean tent could ever give it to them, and none could ever take it away. Riz looked at his men, truly looked at them. He saw the ghosts of the fallen standing shoulder to shoulder with the living. He saw a battalion that had transcended its orders to become something more. He saw the real, unclassifiable truth of their victory. He turned his back on the command tents and walked down the line, shaking each man's hand. No words were needed. The deal was accepted. They would carry the weight of their secret and the memory of their true victory together. The bridge was just a piece of concrete and steel. What they had built there was unbreakable.